Hi everybody, hope you've had a good week so far. We are of course in Chapter 2 in American History, and this week we are looking at the initial contact between Europeans and Native Americans. Just like last week, I'm not going to go through every slide, but I'm going to highlight some of the slides and just discuss them briefly. So we're going to talk about again the expansion of Europe, the Spanish in the Americas, and also the explorations of the English and the French in North America. Here you see a picture, a European description, if you will, done in around 1562, around that time, depicting French Huguenots meeting Native Americans on the French coast. These are some questions to consider as you're going through the chapter and really getting down, I guess, the nitty-gritty, if you will, of the chapter. A lot of times in American history we'll talk about Roanoke as the lost colony. Roanoke, of course, was a colony founded by the English early on in the settlement of the country. The colony was founded. The leader of the colony went back to England to gather supplies. They came back, and the colony had pretty much disappeared. No one was left, and there are several explanations, several hypotheses for that. But this was the first attempted English settlement, and it didn't work. And it kind of set things back, at least in the English perspective, for a while. Here you can kind of see what I just mentioned. So Europe. Before Columbus, Western Europe had begun to see a growth in its population. Europe, the plague, of course, had killed a third of the population, but the population had begun to rebound. A lot of the peasants were tied to the land. They paid tribute to the local lords. Roman Catholicism was the prevalent religion. Famine was prevalent, and so a lot of peasants were looking for a place to go. And so a rebound around 1500 really sets the stage for expansion, because people are now willing, for either religious reasons or for wanting a better way of life for the family, looking to really take a chance on exploration. Here you can see the major nations of Europe around 1500. As I mentioned, this expansion is fueled by population growth, but it's also fueled by commercial growth. The European economy had begun to rebound. A lot of trade with Muslim and Asian markets. A lot of discussion about man's place in the world throughout the Renaissance. There was a revitalized interest in classical culture, revitalized interest in exploration. And this all led really the merchant class to begin to subsidize or to fund expansion and exploration into new worlds and new places. On that, the Portuguese are from the first and really the first nation to expand. They're the ones that established the Atlantic slave trade, but their primary focus was Africa, not the Americas. You see an artifact. Columbus, of course, was the first European, if you will, to reach the Americas in 1492. This was right at the end of the Spanish reconquest of Spain. It had been occupied by the Muslims, and they were now able to, I guess, quote-unquote, kick them out. Spain is able to finance Columbus's expedition. In October 1492, as this little poem goes, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and he reaches the Caribbean. He goes back to Spain with wealth. He goes back to Spain with inhabitants that could be enslaved. Discovers the clockwise circulation of the Atlantic winds and the currents. The one interesting thing about Columbus is Columbus always believed he had got to India. Even the rumor is shot a person for saying that he didn't get to India, that he had gotten to the Americas. And so even up until his deathbed, for all we know, is he believed he had found a route to India, which of course we know he did not. He found a route, or I guess you could say his route led him to what would become North and South America. Here you can see a picture of kind of what it would look, what people thought about it, I guess, if you will. This reconquest. This is Columbus bidding farewell in 1492 to Isabella and Ferdinand in Spain. Later Columbus's voyages, he was very violent, a participant in the slave trade, very obsessed with gold. In a lot of respects, decimated the slave population. And without these slaves, a lot of the colonies entered into depression. Spain was dissatisfied, ordered the arrest of Columbus, actually. Columbus dies in 1506. But it's his greed, his obsession with gold that really destroys the early Spanish colonies that Columbus would establish. Now, I want to talk about the Spanish in the Americas just for a second. And you can kind of see on this map where Spain was concentrated at: Russians, French, English, and Dutch. A picture here of what now is Mexico City. At the time was the capital of the Aztec Empire, situated in the middle of a swamp, basically. When the Spanish came, they came for gold, God, and country. And not particularly in that order. Primarily gold, country, and then God. And God being they wanted to Christianize the Native Americans they came in contact with. They slaughtered the inhabitants who wouldn't convert. They slaughtered the inhabitants who wouldn't give them gold. They developed systems, or encomienda systems, which were basically pieces of land that everything on that land belonged to the lord of the land. When I say everything on the land belonged to him, even the Indians living on the land belonged to the lord of the land. Now, they were supposed to protect the Native Americans, and in turn they were a forced labor system for the Spanish. But of course, the Spanish lords never protected them really. They just used them for the labor. Hernan Cortez in 1517 conquers the largest of the Native American empires, the Aztec Empire, aided primarily by disease. If it wasn't for disease and infighting, Cortez most likely would not have been able to conquer the Aztec Empire. But particularly smallpox wiped out a large number of the Aztec natives. And of course, they gained huge profits. Spanish guns, horses, disease, all overcame Indian resistance. Eventually, Spain is blamed for its cruelty, but it's also used to justify other nations' imperialism as being more humane, but they did not cause the destruction like the Spanish did. Going forward, past this one. This is an interesting diagram. You can see the population, Native American population in millions between 1600 and 1800, going from around 7 million down to less than 2 million, with the total population actually increasing after 1750, primarily because of people settling here from Europe. Skip on that. The Clement Exchange. This is an important part of American history, primarily because you're talking about the exchange of biological diseases, biological crops, but also the exchange of ideas. Of course, as I mentioned just previously, smallpox decimates the Native American population. But at the same time, American metals like gold and silver really stimulate the European economy, but also lower the living standards of a lot of Europeans because the price became so high for common goods. some crops that came to Europe that were not here, that were not there before the interaction with the Americas, things like corn, potatoes, cotton, chocolate, tobacco. These first two here, corn and potatoes, are primarily important. Potatoes, of course, because a lot of Europe, it was easy to grow, a lot of Europeans could grow it. Corn, because there are really three things you can do with it. Potatoes as well, but corn, more importantly, corn, you can eat it, you can drink it, corn mash, Alcorn whiskey, but then you also feed it to your livestock. And so corn became a very important crop in Europe upon its arrival. Now, going the other direction, if you will, things like wheat, sugar, rice came to the Americas. Pigs, cattle, horses caused a lot of damage, but also transformed native culture, particularly the horse in the Great Plains, which became a very important part of Native American life in the American West, particularly in the hunting of buffalo and the moving of people and goods from place to place. You can kind of see the trade routes here, the voyages. The Spanish, the first attempt at a colony was in Florida. It failed miserably. And primarily the Spanish were looking for gold. They didn't really want to establish permanent settlements per se. They wanted to establish settlements that allowed them to explore for gold and then move on to the next location. Again, no great cities. Spain lost interest in the south and southwest for about the next 50 years. Although they claimed it, they didn't do a lot with it. Now, in the north, you're talking primarily about the English, the French, and Dutch. This was in stark contrast to the Spanish because they were really looking at establishing trade relations between the natives, not conquering them, but working with them. Primarily the French and English and Dutch and looking for furs, because they could take those furs and then trade them or sell them in Europe and make quite a bit of money off of them. Now, disease and wars, just like the Spanish, do reduce Indian population. The Indians do become dependent upon European manufactured goods, and so it's not always a great thing for this encounter to happen. You do have some focus on religion by the English and the French, but not as much as you have by the Spanish. Again, the Spanish were there to conquer and to convert. The French and the English primarily were there to trade and to conquer. If they can convert them, great. If they couldn't, oh well. The primary focus of the English and French in terms of religion, though, was a place for dissidents, a place for religiously persecuted to find sanctuary. And that became really prevalent with the English enclosure movement and with the return of Catholicism to England. The enclosure movement basically was a movement that it enclosed the land and did not allow for small farms. This displaced a lot of people to the cities because they had to give up their farming way of life. Under Mary I in England, you had a return to Catholicism, a persecution of Protestants. Under Elizabeth I, you have a restoration of Protestantism, but really the ground had been laid, if you will, for the colonization of North America, particularly by the English. And again, in the 100 years or so after Columbus, so from 1492 to 1592, much of the Atlantic Pacific coast of North America is explored, most of the Atlantic coast is explored, and the interior of the southeast and southwestern North America. Now, that's just a quick overview of the chapter. I highlighted what I thought were the most important points in the chapter. If you have any questions, please let me know. I hope this has been somewhat helpful to you. Hope you have a great week and enjoy the class.